Okay, so picture this a family dinner meant to celebrate my recovery. Right. But instead, my parents drop a bomb. I'm being disinherited. Just like that. And yeah, it gets worse. There's greed, manipulation, secrets everyone's been hiding, and one person quietly watching it all, ready to shake everything up. You're about to see betrayal, high stakes, and some twists that, honestly, I didn't see coming. Stick around because this is not your typical family drama, and trust me, you won't want to blink. I still remember walking into that dining room, and honestly, I was shaking not just from the tremor in my hand that hadn't gone away since I got out of the hospital, but from this weird mix of hope and fear. 3 days earlier, I'd been discharged after a serious heart issue, and my body still felt like it belonged to someone else. Every muscle was sore, my left hand barely steady enough to hold a fork, and yet there I was, in my parents' warm, suffocating dining room, trying to act normal. My parents, Martin and Linda, had been so insistent. "It's just a family dinner. Sarah, we need to talk about your future," my mother had chirped over the phone. I thought, okay, maybe they're finally going to check in on me in a way that's more than just perfunctory niceties. Maybe they'd offer some help, some support while I navigated this fragile recovery. But I should have known better. Weakness in this family was never a call for compassion. It was a signal for the predators to circle. The air in the room was heavy, cloying, too warm, almost like it was holding its breath along with me. My father, Martin, sat at the head of the table, carving a roast with that precision that always made me a little uneasy. Like he was a surgeon, but this was a battlefield and the knife was sharper than necessary. My mother fluttered around, refilling wine glasses, except mine, because of my medication, and glancing at the clock like she had rehearsed every anxious gesture. And then there was Grandpa Paul, at the far end opposite Martin, physically frail. Yes, but those eyes, blue, piercing, glittering shards of flint, never missed a thing. He hadn't said a word since the soup course. He just sat there, hands folded over the mahogany cane, observing. I forced a smile and tried to appear steady. I didn't want to draw attention to the trembling of my fork, or the way my body felt like it was made of fragile glass. I even managed to answer the small talk about the hospital with thin politeness. But when my father asked about finances, my chest tightened. I explained carefully about insurance, the firm pausing operations while I recovered, and the possibility I'd have to tap into savings I'd been hoarding for a house down payment. I tried to keep my voice steady, but it probably sounded thin and shaky. And then they dropped it. Linda smoothed her napkin, gave me that tight, grimacing smile that never reached her eyes, and said, almost too casually, that this was what they wanted to discuss the inheritance. My heart lurched. The thud, almost painful. Restructure, they called it. And in the next words, I felt the air suck out of the room. They had decided my share everything, the house, investments, even the business I'd nurtured to give to Beatrice, my cousin. I think I laughed, but it was more a hollow sound, a reflex to the absurdity. Beatrice, the cousin who had bullied me through high school, who had borrowed money from me years ago and never repaid it, the golden child who always seemed to glide through life without consequence. And yet, she was now deemed more deserving than me, who had just survived a near-fatal heart condition, who had spent years building a firm from nothing, who had dedicated so much of my life to being reliable, strong, capable. I tried to speak. "I'm currently unemployed on medical orders," I said, voice rising in disbelief. "I am sitting here recovering from a heart condition caused by overwork, and you're telling me Beatrice, who has never held a job for more than 3 months, is more deserving." Martin grinned, that nervous tick making his cruelty look almost accidental. "It's about need, Sarah," he said. "Her kids need it more. It takes a village." I stared at them, my body trembling, a mix of rage and disbelief coursing through me. The fork clinked against the china as I set it down, sharp and metallic, a punctuation mark to the betrayal. I tried to understand. I wanted to see some logic, some explanation that made sense, but there was none. It wasn't just the money, it was the principle. All those years I'd worked, all the sacrifices, all the silent labor, the gardening, the rentals, the tax messes I had done it quietly, without asking for a dime. And my reward was being discarded for someone deemed weaker, someone who played the part of struggling better than I ever could. The nausea churned, hot and acidic, and I realized it wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about being invisible to the people I had devoted myself to. Beatrice, sitting there, smiling sweetly, unaware of the chaos she caused, barely acknowledging my presence, and the room felt like a cage, stifling and claustrophobic. I could feel the pulse in my temples, each beat echoing the sense of isolation. The grandfather clock ticked, its sound amplified in the silence, each second a reminder of the unfairness of it all. I tried to make sense of my parents' logic. "Appearances can be deceiving," my mother said, her tone hardening. She puts on a brave face. "You wouldn't understand. You don't have children. You don't know the pressure of providing." And I countered, "Yes, I do. I have employees. People depend on me. That's why I'm in this condition." But they weren't hearing me. They weren't seeing me. They saw what they wanted: a resilient, independent daughter who didn't need their help. And they punished that. My eyes wandered to Grandpa Paul, still observing, chewing the inside of his cheek, his blue eyes flicking between Martin, Linda, and me. And in that moment, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. A barely perceptible nod, like he was silently acknowledging that yes, this was unconscionable. I remembered his words from years ago, when I was 17. "People get funny when they see zeros on a bank statement." He had said, "They forget who earned it. Never let them convince you that you don't matter." That memory brought a flicker of clarity in the haze of shock. I realized then that I wasn't just a victim of their decision. I had been conditioned to serve as the reliable engine, the fixer, the one who kept everything running while others played the part of family. Beatrice was the show pony. I was the unsung labor behind the curtain. And that realization, that cold, calculated awareness, mixed with the physical weakness and the emotional betrayal, created a strange clarity. My body trembled, but my mind was already moving, thinking. How could I respond? How could I survive this? How could I reclaim what they tried to take? The room stayed stiflingly warm, the metallic clink of silverware, the faint scent of roast, and the weight of my parents' smiles pressed against me. But beneath it all, I felt a spark, a seed of resolve. I wasn't done, not yet. And I think, deep down, that was when the story really began. Right there in that dining room, under the cold, patronizing eyes of my parents, and with Grandpa Paul quietly watching, ready for what came next. Grandpa Paul sat at the far end of the table, a quiet sentinel amid the storm of my parents' performance. At 89, his body was frail, bent with age, and yet there was a tension in his frame, a subtle alertness that made it clear he wasn't just fading into the background. His hands rested over the polished mahogany cane, knuckles white, but his eyes, those eyes were sharp, cutting through the polite veneer and the lies, piercing right to the heart of the scene. He hadn't spoken a word, not since the soup, just watching, absorbing, and calculating, like some ancient chess master seeing every possible move before it happened. There was a rhythm to the way he observed, a deliberate slowness that made you think he wasn't reacting, when in truth, he was cataloging every expression, every twitch, every lie sliding out of my parents' practiced faces. I kept catching his gaze, and each time, I felt it like a small jolt, a reminder that not everyone in that room was fooled, that not all eyes had been dulled by arrogance or habit. I thought about the lessons he'd taught me over the years. When I was 17, he had pulled me into his study, leather-bound ledger in hand, and shown me the truth about money and power. People get funny when they see zeros on a bank statement. He had said, voice gravelly but certain, they forget who earned it. You have a good head on your shoulders. Never let them convince you that you don't matter. I could feel that lesson now, as a steady pulse beneath the chaos. It reminded me that this wasn't just a personal attack. It was an entire ecosystem of expectation and manipulation, one I'd been conditioned to navigate carefully. My parents were grinning, satisfied with their display of generosity toward Beatrice, their self-righteousness radiating in waves that made the air feel heavy and stagnant. But Grandpa Paul, he wasn't swayed by theatrics or self-congratulation. The contrast between their arrogance and his quiet wisdom was striking. Where they saw virtue in ostentatious giving and appearances, he understood control, foresight, and resilience. I watched him, and slowly, a thought began to form. Fragile and tentative at first, if he was paying attention. Really paying attention, maybe. Just maybe. There was hope. Hope that this wouldn't be the final move. That the outcome wasn't sealed by their smug smiles or Beatrice's predatory charm. I felt a strange mix of fear and relief, knowing that the elder in the room, the one they treated as furniture, had not only noticed the injustice but understood it, and that understanding carried weight. He hadn't interrupted, hadn't scolded or scowled, but the subtle nods, the flickers of recognition in his eyes, hinted at a strategy of his own, a slow burn waiting for the precise moment to ignite. And as my parents continued, discussing finances and need with a smug sense of moral superiority, I found myself tracing the invisible lines of power that Grandpa Paul could exploit. I could almost see the chessboard, the pieces moving under his control. And for the first time in that evening, my panic gave way to calculation. The tremor in my hand was still there, but my mind was clearing. The haze of shock lifting as I remembered that lesson. People who think they control everything often overlook the quiet observer, the one who doesn't need to shout or insist because their authority is absolute in its patience and its timing. I glanced back at him, and there it was again, that barely noticeable nod, a tiny signal that he remembered me, that he believed in me. that he had a plan, and that he was silently inviting me to play along. It was like a spark in a dark room, a subtle promise that the outcome of tonight was not yet written, and that the power in that room might not belong entirely to my parents or Beatrice. That moment, fleeting but electric, shifted something inside me. I realized that while they saw weakness, he saw potential. While they smiled at their own cleverness, he was cataloging their arrogance, and that somehow gave me strength. Not physical strength, not the kind measured in heartbeats or tremors, but a mental clarity that began to organize the chaos around me. I could start seeing moves, anticipating reactions, and preparing a strategy that might turn the night on its head. Grandpa Paul hadn't moved a muscle, hadn't uttered a word, but his presence alone, that steady, unblinking watchfulness, reminded me that even in a room full of betrayal, there were pieces still in play, and one of them was mine to move. The doorbell rang just as the silence in the dining room had grown unbearable. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your chest feel tight. My stomach dropped when Linda's eyes lit up like a schoolgirl seeing her favorite guest arrive. Beatrice was here, of course. She swept into the room like a whirlwind of perfume and jangling jewelry. Designer tracksuit hugging her like it had been made for a runway. Not a casual family gathering. The tiny clutch she carried seemed almost comical, so obviously expensive. Yet she held it like it was a crown. Her smile was sharp, rehearsed, predatory almost, and it landed on me immediately. "Sarah, wow, you look rested," she cooed, voice dripping sweetness. I blinked, rested my face pale, still recovering from heart surgery, my body weak, trembling, and here she was, patronizing me with faux concern. I forced a cold reply. "I was in the cardiac ICU, Beatrice." She waved a manicured hand, brushing past the reality of my words, dismissing them like they were a bad scent. The tension thickened, tangling with the aroma of roast and wine. She ignored Grandpa Paul completely, sliding into the chair next to him without acknowledgement, and immediately turned her attention to my parents. The rehearsed performance of grateful niece beginning in earnest. Her eyes flicked to the table, then to the room, calculating, measuring. This wasn't just a visit, it was a power play. She was assessing the furniture, the artwork, the silver, marking her territory even before dessert had arrived. And then came the casual line, the one that froze my blood. "So, is the surprise ready?" she asked. Voice light, like she was talking about a party favor instead of the fact that my life was being dismantled. My jaw tightened as I realized my parents weren't just passive accomplices. They were orchestrators. They wanted to do this in front of her, to flaunt the betrayal. I felt a mix of disbelief, nausea, and a creeping cold fury. My body was weak, yes, but my mind was screaming, trying to map every movement, every expression, every angle. Beatrice leaned back, swirling the wine Linda had just poured, though I wasn't allowed a drop. She tilted her head, the light catching on her jewelry, and smiled, calculating, knowing she had the upper hand, enjoying the discomfort she caused. My parents were laughing along, leaning into her charm, their satisfaction palpable. The social dynamics were so obvious now. She was the darling, the perfect niece, the one who brought grandchildren, who played the role of needy but charming. And I was, in their eyes, irrelevant, vulnerable, strong, resilient, not the type who needed saving. And that, apparently, was my crime. I clenched my hands in my lap, feeling the tremor in my fingers intensify. I wanted to speak, to argue, to expose the hypocrisy, but I had to stay measured, patient, biding my time. I could feel the strategy forming, a cold, deliberate realization that I needed more than outrage. I needed leverage. Her entitlement was palpable, a living, breathing thing that filled the room. And every smile, every tilt of her head, every flicker of her eyes was a reminder of the stakes. My parents, drunk on their own generosity, saw only what they wanted to see, and in that blindness, they underestimated the observer in the room, Grandpa Paul, and underestimated me, quietly taking stock. I realized, with a clarity that both terrified and energized me, that this dinner wasn't just a dinner, it was a stage, and I needed to understand every cue, every performance, every hidden motive if I was going to survive what was coming. Beatrice, oblivious to my awareness, continued her practice charm, laughing lightly, speaking softly, never acknowledging the chaos she was reveling in. And I sat there, heart racing, mind sharpening, understanding for the first time fully what my parents had done, and just how much was at stake if I didn't act fast. The room smelled of wine, roast, and power, and in that moment, I knew the game had truly begun. Then it happened. Slam. The sound was like a gunshot cutting through the room, rattling the silverware, stopping every conversation midair. Grandpa Paul had lifted his heavy oak cane and brought it down on the table with a force that made the polished mahogany tremble. The room went silent, a heavy, almost tangible quiet that sucked the air out of our lungs. I froze, heart racing, staring at him as he straightened slowly, his frailty hidden beneath sheer presence. His blue eyes blazed, not with age, but with the authority of a man who had built an empire from scratch. Every head turned, mouths hanging slightly open. My parents, who had been smirking and preening just moments before, now looked small, uncertain, like children caught doing something they knew was wrong. Beatrice, mid-swirl of wine, froze as if someone had pulled the plug on her confidence. Grandpa's voice boomed across the room, smooth and terrifyingly steady. "Say their names," he commanded. "Let's hear this nonsense out loud. Tell me exactly whose money you are giving away." The word money landed like lead. Martin stammered first, his practiced arrogance faltering. It's the family money, Dad," Linda squeaked, eyes darting between her husband and her father-in-law. Grandpa Paul didn't flinch. He repeated the words, slower this time, each syllable tasting of iron and authority, managing it, robbing Peter to pay Paul. Is that what we call it now? Or, in this case, robbing Sarah to pay for Beatrice's ski trips. His gaze cut through the room like a blade. Beatrice's face went pale, the confident mask slipping. She opened her mouth, but he didn't wait. The fire in his eyes softened just for a moment as they found mine across the room. And I realized something in that heartbeat. He wasn't just confronting them for himself. He was empowering me. He was giving me permission to see clearly, to move, to act. I felt a jolt of strength run through me, my chest tightening, tremor momentarily forgotten. Every ounce of fear and anxiety shifted into focus. Grandpa Paul continued, turning his attention to Martin. His voice was calm now, but each word carried absolute weight. "You are fired. he said. The air seemed to crack as Martin flinched. Then he turned to Beatrice, his gaze icy, unwavering. "Get out of my house before I have you dragged out." The room was stunned, frozen, disbelief written on every face. My parents, who had been confident and self-assured, now looked exposed and small. Beatrice, who had radiated entitlement and charm, looked cornered. Her confidence evaporated into raw fear. I could feel the momentum shift, a tangible change in the energy of the room. Grandpa Paul didn't sit back down. He remained standing, posture straight, voice ringing, every inch of him commanding the space, dictating reality. It was like watching a storm crest, a quiet authority no one had expected, and yet undeniable. I sat there, heart hammering, suddenly aware of my own power alongside him. The fear, the awe, the respect in the room was palpable. The dynamic had completely changed. Suddenly, my parents weren't in control. Beatrice wasn't untouchable, and I wasn't powerless. Grandpa Paul had reminded everyone exactly whose house, whose family, and whose money this was, and in doing so, he had given me the courage to step forward, to understand that the game was no longer theirs to dominate. I felt my body settle into a cold, steady focus. The chaos in my mind cleared, replaced by strategy, observation, and anticipation. He had broken the illusion of control they thought they had, and now, with the room silenced, the air charged with fear and disbelief, I knew the story was shifting, that the power had changed hands, and that this intervention wasn't just a moment, it was a spark that could turn everything around. Grandpa Paul had arrived, unyielding, commanding, and in that room, nothing would ever be the same again. After Grandpa Paul's outburst, the tension in the dining room lingered, thick and suffocating. I followed him out, my legs unsteady, the adrenaline still thrumming through my veins, but there was a sharp clarity in my mind that hadn't been there before. We moved to his study, the familiar scent of old leather, pipe tobacco, and aged paper hitting me like a reminder of permanence, a stark contrast to the chaos we'd just left. He sank into his leather armchair, and for a moment, I can see the wear of age, the trembling in his hands, but there was a fire behind his eyes, an unmistakable resolve. He pointed a shaking finger at the heavy oak safe tucked in the corner. "Combination is your birthday, month, day, year. Open it," he said, voice steady despite his frailty. My hands shook as I knelt before the safe, the tumblers clicking under my fingers. Each turn a small heartbeat of suspense. 041292. The door swung open to reveal not stacks of cash, not gold bars, but something far more powerful. Thick, color-coded binders, meticulously organized, filled with the documents controlling the family estate. He gestured toward the red binder. "Bring the red one," he commanded. I handed it over, flipping it open, feeling the weight of years of meticulous planning in my hands. His hands smoothed the pages with reverence. "Your father thinks he owns everything because I let him play CEO," Grandpa Paul said quietly. "He thinks that stepping back 10 years ago meant the assets transferred automatically. The revocable living trust is under his control, right?" I asked, sitting on the ottoman across from him, my mind racing. He looked at me, a mischievous glint returning to his eye. "Technically, no," he said. "Not while I am neither incapacitated nor dead, as long as I'm here. The control hasn't shifted. My chest tightened as realization dawned. My parents hadn't disinherited me because they couldn't. And that meant there was a way forward, a path to reclaiming what they tried to take, if I played it right. Grandpa Paul reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver key. "This opens the safety deposit box downtown," he explained. "Inside is the original trust, the one that names you as successor trustee if I ever deem your father unfit." He pressed the warm metal into my hand. It was more than a key, it was leverage, a weapon, and a shield all at once. I felt a surge of resolve, a flicker of strategic clarity that cut through the anger and betrayal. This wasn't just about money. This was about control, about justice, about ensuring that my parents couldn't continue to manipulate the estate and empower Beatrice. I realized that to act effectively, I needed more than documents. I needed a plan, evidence, allies. My mind started ticking over possibilities: hire a lawyer who could see through the family games, gather evidence to expose Beatrice's manipulation, secure the trust in a way my parents couldn't undo, and most importantly, protect Grandpa Paul from any attempt to declare him incompetent. Each thought sparked another, forming a lattice of strategy that was both precise and ruthless. I could feel the tremor in my body recede, replaced by a cold, focused determination. Grandpa Paul watched me with a steady gaze, as if measuring my understanding, gauging my readiness, and I was ready. I didn't just want to stop my parents' plan. I wanted to dismantle it completely, to make sure the consequences of their arrogance were undeniable. Holding that red binder, feeling the weight of authority it represented, I realized that I had the tools, the knowledge, and the guidance to turn the tide. The room smelled of old paper and leather, and it seemed to hum with possibilities. Every misstep my parents thought they could take was now visible to me. Every lie Beatrice had spun was now a thread I could pull. I took a deep breath, letting the weight of strategy settle over me. This wasn't just a defensive maneuver, it was the beginning of a calculated offensive. And in that quiet study, with Grandpa Paul by my side, I finally felt like the game had shifted in my favor, even if the battle was only just beginning. The next morning, the house felt almost peaceful, but it was a kind of quiet that precedes a storm, the silence of a trench waiting for the whistle. I stayed in my old bedroom, mostly to keep an eye on Grandpa Paul. But my mind was already racing through plans, contingencies, possibilities. I picked up the landline in his study, the corded phone feeling almost like a lifeline, because I couldn't trust my cell, not with Martin possibly monitoring everything. I dialed Jessica, a friend from college and now a forensic accountant, someone who could read the hidden language of money. And I whispered urgently, "I need you to look into someone. Beatrice Miller. Public records, liens, judgments, anything legal." She promised me an hour. And I hung up, stomach twisting, anticipation building. By noon, I had a PDF in my inbox that made my jaw drop. I walked into the kitchen where my parents were pretending normalcy, Linda scrubbing counters that were already spotless. Martin scowling at a tablet. Beatrice wasn't there yet. My heart raced as I poured myself a glass of water, trying to steady. But my mind was already sifting through the information Jessica had sent. Every wire transfer, every odd payment, every shell company led to the same shocking conclusion. Beatrice had been living a double life of deception and gambling. I could feel the room closing in, even empty of her presence. I called Jessica back, my voice tense, whispering through the receiver. Jessica, the Florida estate. The one she supposedly managed responsibly, she confirmed, and my blood ran cold. It had vanished into bad investments. No offshore accounts, online gambling, high stakes, a pattern I could trace back years. Each discovery was worse than the last. Not just greed, but a compulsive, dangerous habit that now threatened my family. I could feel the stakes rising with every page I scanned, every PDF I opened. There was no room for error, no margin for hesitation. Beatrice wasn't just selfish, she was actively putting my parents' and Grandpa Paul's assets at risk, and they were blind to it. I leaned against the counter, taking a deep breath, letting the shock settle into cold focus. My fingers tapped lightly on the envelope containing the evidence as I mapped my next moves. Hire a lawyer who wouldn't be swayed by family ties. Compile a dossier of every transaction, every fraudulent act. Make sure that when the confrontation came, it wasn't accusations or anger that carried the day, but hard, undeniable proof. I felt a surge of determination that replaced fear. This wasn't just about protecting an inheritance anymore. It was about preventing disaster, about ensuring that the estate, the trust, and Grandpa Paul's intentions were respected. By late afternoon, I had a growing stack of evidence and a strategy forming like a chessboard in my mind. Each piece of paper, each screenshot, each court document was a move I could make against them. I pictured the signing ceremony, Beatrice smugly expecting everything, my parents too self-satisfied to notice their own vulnerability. And I knew that the tide could turn in that room if I played my hand right. I could almost hear the rhythm of it in my head, present the facts, expose the lies, leverage the trust documents, and protect Grandpa Paul from any attempt to bypass his authority. Every detail mattered. Every misstep on their part could become ammunition. And in that quiet, tense apartment, the urgency built into a focused energy, I realized that the battle was no longer hypothetical. It was happening, and I was in the middle of it. The stakes were immense, but for the first time, I felt like I had the tools, the knowledge, and the strategy to fight back effectively. And I knew there was no turning back. The moment Beatrice, my parents, and that signing ceremony came, I would be ready. Armed not just with documents, but with clarity, preparation, and the determination to expose the truth before they could claim victory. Friday morning felt heavy, gray, like the sky itself was holding its breath. Knowing the storm about to hit inside that house, I pulled up the driveway. Cars lined up like spectators, the pastor's Lexus, the notary's hatchback, and of course, Beatrice's leased Range Rover, parked like a flag claiming her territory. The whole scene was staged to perfection, designed for appearances, for the illusion of virtue and family harmony. I caught my reflection in the visor mirror, tired. Yes, but my weakness was gone, replaced by focus, determination. I adjusted my blazer, gripped the briefcase tightly, feeling its weight not just as papers, but as ammunition. Mr. Henderson, the lawyer Grandpa Paul recommended, sat beside me, calm, imposing, and ready. I nodded. Let's go. The door was unlocked, inviting me into the lion's den, and we stepped inside. The living room was grotesquely perfect flowers arranged just so. The legal documents spread like sacred scrolls. My parents at the center, smiling, Eager for their audience, Beatrice sat primly, dabbing at a tissue, the very picture of humility, playing the grateful niece for everyone's benefit. And in the corner, Grandpa Paul, slumped in his wheelchair, groggy from the sedatives she had been feeding him for days. My stomach twisted. The air smelled of flowers, polished wood, and tension so thick it could be sliced with a knife. I stepped forward, voice cutting through the performance. Stop. Heads turned, every eye in the room on me. Linda gasped, clutching pearls. Sarah, you weren't invited. I kept my tone cold, measured. I'm here to save you from federal prison. Mom, I said, stepping into the room with Henderson flanking me, and to save Grandpa from that predator. Beatrice's confident smile faltered, eyes narrowing. She's crazy, Uncle Martin. Call the police. She's harassing me. Henderson's baritone filled the space. Steady, controlled. I think the authorities would be very interested, especially in your attempts to coerce a medicated elder into signing legal documents. Martin's protest was weak, fumbling. He's not medicated. He's just tired. I held up my phone, displaying Mrs. Gable's texts. The housekeeper confirming Beatrice had been giving Grandpa her sleeping pills for 3 days. A murmur went through the room, disbelief rippling through each guest. Beatrice shrieked. Lies, she's jealous. She's making it up. I didn't hesitate. I opened the briefcase, spreading documents across the table bank statements. Colorful graphs of wire transfers, logos of online casinos, a court document from the Florida estate lawsuit. I began to lay it all out. $300,000 in slot machine losses over the last 18 months. $50,000 wired to a shell company in the Caymans last week. And this, I held up the court file, is proof of fraud. You didn't lose the Florida estate in bad investments. You gambled it away. The room fell silent, the weight of evidence pressing on everyone. Linda picked up a bank statement, hands trembling. Beatrice, she whispered. Disbelief etched across her face. Beatrice lunged for the papers. Henderson moved instantly, blocking her path with a calm but immovable presence. These are certified forensic audits. Miss Miller, admissible in court. I turned to my father, voice breaking slightly. You were going to give her everything. Let her gamble away Grandpa's legacy. Bankrupt you, for what a thank you card. Martin's face paled, shock and shame warring across his features. Beatrice's fury had nowhere to hide, her mask of entitlement shattered. She screamed, snarled, the confidence she had carried for so long gone, replaced by desperation. Grandpa Paul, frail but alert, blinked, clearing the fog from the sedatives, understanding fully. I knelt beside him, gripping his hand. Grandpa, can you hear me, Sarah? I'm here, he rasped, voice weak but steady. I have the trust. I have the key. I said. He met my gaze, clarity piercing the haze. Then, in that moment, he found his strength. Martin, his voice like thunder despite its frailty. You are fired. Martin flinched. Every ounce of arrogance and self-assuredness stripped away in an instant. Grandpa turned to Beatrice, eyes icy and unwavering. Get out of my house before I have you dragged out. Beatrice grabbed her purse, screamed her fury, and stormed out, knocking over a vase that shattered, crystal shards marking the punctuation of her deceit. The room was still, heavy with the echo of her departure. Within an hour, law enforcement and the restraining order were already in motion. Henderson had forwarded evidence to the Florida authorities. My parents, stunned, slumped, confronted by the reality they had ignored for so long. Grandpa Paul, though frail, was steady and alert, asserting control, ensuring the trust in his estate remained secure. I breathed, the chaos settling into clarity. The confrontation had exposed the lies, the fraud, the entitlement, and the blind arrogance that almost cost us everything. Justice, strategy, and courage had collided, leaving truth standing at the center of the room. The battle was over. The victory wasn't just legal, it was personal, moral, and absolute. In that moment, the room, once staged for deception, had become a courtroom of truth, and the outcome was undeniable. I exhaled, letting the tension drain, knowing the stakes had been high, but that the truth had finally won. The aftermath of the signing ceremony felt surreal, like the world had shifted on its axis and everyone was trying to adjust to the new gravity. Beatrice's downfall was swift and complete. Within an hour of her storming out, Henderson had already filed a restraining order, securing Grandpa Paul's safety and preventing her from returning. The Florida estate evidence, the gambling losses, and the fraudulent transfers were forwarded to the district attorney, and from what I later learned, she was facing multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and mismanagement of funds. The confident socialite who had stormed into the dining room expecting triumph was now a cornered, accountable adult, her carefully constructed image crumbling into fragments that even my parents could no longer ignore. I remember sitting in the living room, the broken vase from her exit still lying on the floor, shards of crystal reflecting sunlight, a tangible symbol of the chaos she had brought into our lives. Martin and Linda sat quietly, shoulders slumped, the arrogance replaced with shame and a kind of careful fear. For the first time, they understood that trust isn't a right, it's an asset, one that they had mismanaged by putting appearances and shallow perceptions above responsibility. Their eyes, once filled with self-satisfaction, now held something new respect, cautious and hesitant, for the person who had stood against deception, for the reality they had tried to ignore. The shift in their demeanor was subtle but undeniable. They were still my parents, of course, but the dynamic had changed. The conversations that followed were quieter, less performative, more measured. They asked questions, genuinely seeking understanding. And for the first time, I could see them listening rather than instructing. Our Sunday dinners continued, but there was a weight to them, a recognition that respect is earned and can be lost. I didn't have to argue or prove myself anymore. The truth had done that work for me. Grandpa Paul's recovery was steady, though the doctors confirmed he would never be as physically robust as before. Mentally, however, he was sharper than ever, relieved and unburdened that his intentions for the estate were now secured. We spent our weekends together at the lake house, my lake house now, though it had always been a shared family space. Pushing him down to the dock I had built, watching the sun dip below the horizon, was a reminder of what had been at stake and what had been saved. There were quiet moments when he would pat my hand, a simple gesture of approval and pride. "You did good, kid," he would say, his voice wheezing but joyful. And in those moments, I understood that victory wasn't measured in documents or court filings alone. It was in the restoration of peace, the reassertion of rightful authority, and the closure of a chapter marked by betrayal and deceit. My own life gradually returned to balance. The arrhythmia that had plagued me stabilized as the stress of the imminent disinheritance and manipulation faded. My firm paused for months during my recovery, resumed operations, and I began hiring trusted staff, including Mrs. Gable, who had loyally supported our household for decades. I could breathe again, plan again, and live without the constant pressure of anticipating deceit. The family dynamic, though changed, found a kind of equilibrium. My parents' respect was cautious, but real. Their behavior no longer patronizing or condescending, but tempered by the knowledge that authority and responsibility are not interchangeable, and that I, too, had a claim to be acknowledged. Grandpa Paul, once an observer, now had the satisfaction of seeing the estate, the trust, and the family legacy secure. His guidance and foresight had been the key to turning chaos into order, ensuring that fairness and accountability prevailed. I reflected on everything: the betrayals, the near loss, the meticulous planning and research, the courage to confront both family and legal threats, and realized how much clarity and strength came from confronting truth head on. Holding the trust documents, knowing Beatrice was accountable and that the estate was safeguarded, I felt a profound sense of closure. The chaos, the deception, and the danger had been contained, and justice had been served without needing to resort to anything outside the law or reasoned strategy. The lessons of loyalty, persistence, and careful planning had crystallized into experience that would guide me for the rest of my life. Sitting by the lake with Grandpa Paul, the sky streaked in gold, reflecting on our victory, I felt an unexpected calm wash over me. It was a kind of peace born not from avoidance or ignorance, but from confronting reality fully, taking action when necessary, and standing unwavering in the face of pressure, deceit, and manipulation. I smiled as he squeezed my hand, a simple but profound gesture. "I just did what the landscape required," he said with a chuckle, referencing the care and attention I had put into the lake house and its surroundings, the metaphor extending naturally to the life and legacy I had now helped protect. I knew then that survival, strategy, and courage were intertwined, and that protecting what matters most requires both intelligence and heart. The sunsets over the lake, golden and fleeting, became symbols of victory, of endurance, and of the rewards of confronting truth with clarity and determination. For anyone watching, this story is a reminder that standing up for what's right, even against those closest to you, is hard, messy, and sometimes frightening, but it's worth it. If you've enjoyed seeing this story unfold, hit like, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of triumph, resilience, and unexpected victories. Trust me, you'll want to see what comes next.